I'm a 23-year-old woman, and my family's life has always revolved around my grandparents' house, nestled just outside the city on a sprawling piece of land. My dad works out of town, and my mom used to cherish living here, not just to help her folks, but also because it was the perfect place to raise me. Tragically, my mom passed away from cancer about 12 years ago. It was a crushing blow that left a void in our lives. My dad, still needing to work to support us, had no choice but to continue his job away from home. So, I remained with my grandparents, who became my world. They showered me with love and did everything they could to fill the gap my mom left behind. Whenever Dad was home, he made every moment count. We'd spend time together, and sometimes he'd stay in the room he once shared with Mom. Other times, we'd escape on little vacations, trying to find joy despite our loss. I often wished Mom hadn't been taken from us so soon, but I felt grateful for the love that still surrounded me. As the years passed, life continued to throw curveballs. Both my grandparents eventually passed away over the last couple of years. Losing them felt like losing Mom all over again. They were my anchors, my safe haven. My mom was an only child, and so am I, so their legacy naturally passed down to me. My mom's life insurance had gone to Dad, who used it to renovate the house, a place that held so many cherished memories. My grandparents never charged him rent. They saw it as an investment in our family's future. I realize this might sound a bit confusing, but the essence is that the house became mine. My grandmother's will left everything to me: the house, their savings, and even my grandpa's old truck, a sentimental treasure. My dad continued to stay there when he wasn't working, and we'd maintain our routine of making the most of our time together. The house wasn't just a structure, it was a tapestry of our family's history, love, and the memories that shaped me. But then, life took another unexpected turn. My dad started dating a couple of years after Mom passed. At first, he never brought anyone home, perhaps out of respect for Mom's memory, or maybe to shield me from more change. That was until he met her. She's young, stylish in a high-maintenance sort of way, and she has 2 little kids of her own. Dad seemed happier than I'd seen him in a long time, and despite my reservations, I wanted to support him. He sat me down one day, his eyes hopeful yet cautious, and asked if they could move into the house with us. It's a big place, and I have a large area all to myself. Part of me hesitated. The house held so much of our family's past, but I agreed, thinking it might be good for Dad to find happiness again. They moved in, and for about 6 months, we coexisted under the same roof. It was an adjustment, to say the least. The halls that once echoed with the quiet comfort of familiarity now bustled with the noise of young children and the presence of someone who felt like a stranger in my own home. Then came the news. She was pregnant. Dad was over the moon and decided to propose to her. I wanted to be happy for him, truly. He deserved happiness after all the years of loneliness and hard work. But something didn't feel right. That's when the whispers began, small comments that slowly grew louder. My soon-to-be stepmother, Tabia, started hinting that perhaps it was time for me to think about moving out. She mentioned needing my room for the new baby, and that her mother was planning to come live with us to help out. Each word felt like a tiny dagger. This was my home, my sanctuary filled with the ghosts of those I loved most. The thought of leaving was unimaginable. I waited, hoping my dad would step in and clarify things, but his silence was deafening. One evening, as we all sat awkwardly around the dinner table, Tabia brought it up directly. She suggested I could move to the city to finish my education, and even offered me her old apartment at a discounted rate. The audacity left me speechless. I looked to my dad, searching for support, but he avoided my gaze. Frustration bubbled inside me. Finally, I mustered the courage to speak. I told her plainly that this was my house, left to me by my grandparents, and I had no intention of leaving. The atmosphere grew tense. Tabia seemed taken aback, perhaps not expecting me to stand my ground. My dad finally looked at me, but his eyes were filled with conflict. She argued that they needed more space for their growing family, and I suggested that with Dad's savings and the potential sale of her apartment, they could afford their own place. That's when the accusations started. Suddenly, I was the villain, the ungrateful daughter forcing her father to drain his retirement savings. Tabia refused to consider selling her apartment, insisting the market was only going up and she wanted to build equity. I felt cornered and betrayed. How had it come to this? Why was I being pushed out of my own home? The place that held all my memories, both joyful and painful, was being threatened, and the people doing it were my own family, or at least they were supposed to be. Dad's lack of support hurt the most. I couldn't understand why he wouldn't stand up for me, why he wouldn't acknowledge that this was my rightful home. His silence felt like a betrayal, deepening the chasm growing between us. The days that followed were filled with tension. Tabia barely spoke to me, and when she did, it was laced with thinly veiled contempt. She began rallying my dad's side of the family against me, painting me as the selfish daughter unwilling to help her father start anew. Relatives I hadn't heard from in years were suddenly calling me, urging me to reconsider, telling me how happy Dad was and how I should be supportive. It was infuriating. None of them knew the whole story. They didn't understand that I wasn't opposing Dad's happiness. I was defending my right to stay in my own home, the home my grandparents had left for me, the place where every corner held a memory, every room echoed with the laughter and love of those who were no longer here. One afternoon, I found myself sitting alone in the backyard, the weight of the situation pressing heavily on my shoulders. I remembered planting flowers with my grandma near the old oak tree, the way she'd smile and hum her favorite songs. I could almost hear my grandpa's laughter as he taught me how to drive the old truck, his eyes twinkling with mischief. Tears welled up in my eyes. I couldn't bear the thought of leaving all this behind, especially not under these circumstances. I realized I had to take a stand, not just for myself, but for the legacy my grandparents had entrusted to me. I decided to consult a lawyer to understand my rights fully. It turned out that I was well within my legal authority to ask them to leave if it came to that. Armed with this knowledge, I approached my dad once more, hoping to reach some understanding. "Dad, this is tearing us apart," I began softly. "I want you to be happy, but I also need you to understand how important this house is to me." He looked tired, older than his years. "I know," he sighed. "But Tabia feels that we need more space, especially with the baby coming." "Then maybe it's time you consider finding your own place," I suggested gently. "I can't just leave. This isn't just a house to me. It's my home." He rubbed his temples, the weight of the situation evident. "You know I don't have the funds to buy a new house right now," he admitted. "What about Tabia's apartment?" I asked. "If she sells it, and with your savings, you could afford something suitable." "She doesn't want to sell," he replied. "She sees it as an investment." I couldn't help but feel a surge of frustration. "So her investment is more important than my home?" He didn't answer, and the silence spoke volumes. The breaking point came when I overheard Tabia making plans to redecorate my room for the baby, discussing paint colors and crib styles as if I'd already agreed to leave. It was the final straw. I confronted them both. "I won't be pushed out of my own home," I declared firmly. "If you insist on needing more space, then you need to find somewhere else to live." Tabia scoffed. "You're being unreasonable. We're a growing family. Can't you see that?" "I see that you're expecting me to sacrifice everything while you give up nothing," I shot back. "This house was left to me by my grandparents. It's all I have left of them. I won't abandon it." Dad looked between us, torn and conflicted. "There has to be a compromise," he pleaded. "I've tried," I replied, my voice wavering. "But it feels like you're choosing her over me." Tabia threw her hands up. "Fine. If you're going to be selfish, maybe we should leave." I nodded. "Maybe that's for the best." In the days that followed, the atmosphere was tense. Plans were made for them to move out, and I felt a mix of sadness and relief. I didn't want to lose my dad, but I couldn't let myself be erased from my own life. As they packed their things, Dad approached me. "I'm sorry it came to this," he said quietly. "I am too," I admitted. but I hope you understand why I had to stand my ground." He nodded slowly. "I do. I just wish things were different." "Me too." They moved out shortly after, and the house returned to a peaceful silence. It was bittersweet. I missed the idea of a happy family, but knew I'd made the right choice. I took solace in the memories of my mom, grandparents, and the life we had here. I decided to honor them by continuing to make this house a place of love and warmth. Maybe one day, Dad and I could mend our relationship, but for now, I needed to heal and find my own path forward. Dad started to seem distant. He called less often, and his messages were short and cold. Then, one evening, I received a cryptic message from him. "We need to talk." He asked to meet me at a cafe downtown, which instantly filled me with worry. Normally, we discussed everything at home, a place where conversations always felt safe. But this time, something was different. Something felt deeply wrong. I arrived early, my stomach twisting in knots as I waited. When he finally walked in, I barely recognized him. His shoulders were slumped, his eyes dull and heavy. He looked like he was carrying the weight of the world. He sank into the seat across from me, and before I could even ask what was wrong, he took a deep breath and started talking. It turned out he was in serious financial trouble. Tabia, despite all her promises, had sold her apartment without telling him, and had spent the money on things she considered necessary for their life and the future baby. She had burned through his savings, drained every penny he had put aside for years, and even racked up debts that creditors were now demanding he pay. I tried to fix it, but every time I thought I was getting closer, it just made things worse, he said quietly, as if afraid someone would overhear. "She's left. She took the kids and disappeared, leaving me with all this debt. I thought I could make this work, that we could build something, but—" My heart shattered. All these years, he had worked so hard, giving up so much to make a better life for us. And now, when he thought he had finally found a new family, everything fell apart. He was left alone, betrayed, broken, abandoned. On top of that, his health had begun to decline. The constant stress, sleepless nights, and overwhelming guilt had worn him down, leaving him struggling just to hold on. I wanted to scream, to tell him that he had sacrificed too much for someone who had never valued him. I wanted to say that she had never deserved his love. But instead, I sat in silence, holding his hand, hoping that somehow I could bring him a small measure of comfort. Not long after, Dad was diagnosed with cancer. The doctors told us it was advanced, too late for anything but comfort care. My world, already fragile, shattered completely. I remember the moment they told us, the sterile hospital room suddenly feeling colder, the walls closing in. I looked at my dad, who had always seemed so strong, and saw a man utterly exhausted, holding back tears for my sake. He tried to stay positive at first, brushing it off with a small smile and saying, "Guess I'll get some time to rest now, huh?" But his face betrayed him. I could see the fear, the realization that his time was slipping away, and there was nothing he could do to stop it. Our home became filled with quiet conversations, doctor's appointments, and the unbearable countdown of days slipping through our fingers. Each day, I would sit by his bedside, holding his hand, feeling the warmth that I knew wouldn't last much longer. He would look at me, his eyes filled with sorrow and love, and we'd talk about everything, memories, regrets, dreams he'd never see come true. Some nights he'd squeeze my hand, apologizing for leaving me, for the mess his life had become. And each time I'd tell him that none of it mattered. All that mattered was him.